They smashed my GPS and my camera right in front of me, and I understood instantly. I wasn't getting out of there alive. When the plastic burst against the rock and the screen shattered into dozens of fragments, everything I thought I knew about survival, science, and control simply stopped making sense. I stood there frozen, unable to react, because in that moment I realized something far worse than being lost in the forest. I realized that someone or something had decided I was not allowed to leave with evidence. And if you're listening to this now, it's because I made a choice years ago that completely changed who I am. That's why I need you to subscribe to this channel, because stories like this don't appear in documentaries. They're not told in reports, and they're almost never spoken out loud. They only survive when someone chooses to listen all the way through. I stayed silent for a long time, years, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I had to learn how to live with the weight of what I saw. There's a massive difference between getting lost in the woods and realizing you've entered a place where nothing should exist except trees, silence, and animals. What happened to me wasn't a quick encounter, nor an isolated experience. It was forced coexistence with something that watches, evaluates, and decides. And their first decision was clear. I would not be able to prove anything. No recordings, no coordinates, no data. Only memory, only guilt, only the constant feeling that if I told this the wrong way, someone would die. While I stood there, surrounded, staring at the broken pieces of my equipment on the ground, I understood that this wasn't an impulsive reaction. It was organized, calculated. There were no screams, no direct violence, but there was absolute control. Every move I made was observed. Every breath felt permitted. And that's something many people don't understand when they talk about the unknown. The real fear isn't the attack. It's the intelligence. It's realizing you're facing something that chooses what to do with you. Something that understands cause, consequence, and above all, the danger humans represent. I know this sounds absurd. I know it sounds impossible. But if you've ever had that strange feeling of being watched in a completely isolated place, if you've ever felt the silence grow too heavy, like the forest itself was waiting for something to happen, then you understand exactly what I'm talking about. And that's why I want you to write in the comments where you're watching from. City, state, country. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, because this story doesn't belong to one place. It belongs to everyone who has ever felt that there's something beyond what we've been taught to accept as reality. Before all of this, I thought I was prepared. I always believed knowledge was protection. Years of study, field experience, months alone in remote regions. None of that saved me. If anything, it's what led me there. I entered that territory believing I was in control, believing I was the one observing, cataloging, studying. But the truth is that from the very first day, I was the one being watched, evaluated, tested, and I realized it far too late. What haunts me most now isn't the moment they destroyed my equipment. It's what came before it. The small signs, almost imperceptible, that I ignored because they didn't fit any logical explanation. The absence of sound, the way certain paths always seemed to lead me back to the same place. The constant sensation of crossing invisible boundaries. None of this happens all at once. The forest doesn't scream, it whispers. And when you finally realize something is wrong, you've already passed the point of no return. I'm not telling this to scare you. I'm telling it because living with this secret cost me everything. My career, my peace, my relationship with the world. There are truths that, once known, can't be forgotten. And what I discovered, there wasn't just the existence of something hidden. It was the realization that we, humans, are not the only ones capable of organization, empathy, strategy, and moral decision-making. And accepting that changes everything. As I gathered what was left of my camera, I realized that was only the beginning. Destroying the evidence was just the first rule. There were others. Rules I didn't yet understand, but that would become painfully clear in the days that followed. And each one came with a cost, a psychological cost, an emotional cost, a cost I still pay today. If you think this ends with a quick encounter or a desperate escape, You're wrong. What happened next was much slower, much deeper, and much harder to explain. Because from that moment on, I was no longer just an intruder. I had been accepted, in a way, and that acceptance came with a responsibility I never asked to carry. I need you to stay with me until the end, because the heaviest part of this story isn't what I saw, but what I had to decide afterward. And it all started there, in that moment, with my GPS shattered, my camera destroyed, and the absolute certainty that I had stepped into a world that did not want to be discovered. I never wanted this to become public, and the simple fact that I'm telling it now already puts me at risk. Before anything else, you need to understand who I am and why this story isn't a delusion, an urban legend, or an invention for attention. I'm a field biologist. I spent over a decade working directly in remote areas, studying animal behavior, migration patterns, isolated ecosystems, and survival in extreme environments. My work has always been based on data, direct observation, and the scientific method. I don't chase mystery. I avoid it. I always have. And it was precisely that rational mindset that made me ignore obvious signs in the beginning. At the time, I was in the Ozarks for a simple official reason: a predator monitoring project and wildlife corridor study in one of the most isolated regions of southern Missouri. Nothing unusual, nothing secret, nothing conspiratorial. I'd done similar work in other states, including areas where human presence is almost non-existent. Going alone was never a problem. On the contrary, I always worked better in isolation. The silence, the repetition of days, the absence of human interference always helped me see patterns others missed. Maybe that's why it took me so long to accept that something was wrong. Because when you spend years studying nature, you learn to trust it. You learn to believe everything has a logical explanation, even if you don't know it yet. And I clung to that belief with everything I had. Every strange sign, every feeling of unease, every out-of-place sound, I forced into a technical explanation. Weather, migration, larger predators, environmental pressure. I needed it to be that, because the alternative was admitting I was dealing with something that shouldn't exist. Silence that kept me quiet for so many years wasn't just fear, it was responsibility. When you understand that simply sharing information can put lives at risk, you start weighing every word. And I'm not talking only about my life. What I saw wasn't just rare, it was vulnerable. And I knew from the start that if this fell into the wrong hands, the outcome would be predictable. Hunters, armed thrill seekers, groups chasing fame, authorities pressured to deal with something they don't understand, greed disguised as research. All of that destroys quickly what took generations to remain hidden. For a long time, I thought keeping this to myself was the only ethical choice. I tried to move on, go back to normal life, pretend it had been nothing more than an isolated traumatic event. But it wasn't. It doesn't fade. It doesn't erase. The more I tried to follow my routine, the more I realized I no longer fully belonged to this comfortable world of certainty. There's I before and after, when you realize we are not the absolute peak of intelligence on this planet. And that's an idea many people aren't ready to accept. I know those watching now may be torn between curiosity and skepticism. That's natural. I denied this reality myself for a long time. If you're here just for entertainment, I understand. But if at some point you feel that quiet discomfort, that sense that something about this makes too much sense, then you're already closer to the truth than you realize. Write in the comments if you've ever felt something like that in a forest, on a remote road, or anywhere the silence felt wrong. You don't need to explain. Just write that you felt it. Those who know. Telling this now is still dangerous. Not because someone will show up at my door tomorrow, but because stories like this spread. And when they spread, they attract attention. Too much attention. I chose every detail I'm sharing. What I leave out matters as much as what I include. I don't mention coordinates, specific trail names, or references that would allow anyone to retrace my path. That's not omission. It's protection. Protection for them. And maybe protection for us too. What scares me most isn't the memory of fear, but the clarity with which I understood, even on that first day, that this wasn't a random encounter. I didn't stumble into something by chance. I was observed before I was accepted into that territory. My presence was tolerated until it became unsafe. When it did, the response was immediate, clean, and without unnecessary violence. That says a lot about the level of awareness that exists there, far more than any sensational story ever has. If you've made it this far, I need you to keep going, because what comes next is where everything truly begins to change. It's when the signs stop being subtle and become impossible to ignore. It's when I begin to understand that I'm not just being watched, but guided, directed, tested, and what started as fieldwork begins to transform into something I could never have imagined when I entered that forest thinking I was in control. And that's exactly where things start to become truly difficult to explain. When I arrived in the Ozarks, nothing seemed out of place at first glance. The access road was long, narrow, and poorly maintained, the kind you only find when you need to go far beyond where you should. My Jeep crawled forward between tall trees, dry branches scraping against the metal, as if the road itself were trying to push me back. I'd driven worse roads, been to more isolated places, but something there felt different. It wasn't fear. It was an uncomfortable sense of crossing a boundary that wasn't marked on any map. The routine began the way fieldwork always does. Stop the vehicle, check coordinates, adjust the pack, review equipment, check load weight, automatic, mechanical. I knew exactly what to do because I'd done it dozens of times. The problem was that even doing everything right, something didn't fit. The silence was too deep. Not the normal quiet of a late autumn forest, but a strange, almost artificial absence of sound. There were no birds. None. Not even distant calls echoing when you enter unfamiliar territory. No insects. No small animals moving through the leaves. Just the sound of my own footsteps. I remember stopping in the middle of the trail for no apparent reason, just to listen more carefully. That's when I realized the silence wasn't an absence of sound. It was containment, as if something had withdrawn on purpose. I kept walking, trying to ignore the feeling, telling myself it was normal, seasonal transition, temperature change, environmental pressure. The excuses came easily, because I needed them. The campsite seemed ideal, close to a clean water source, relatively flat ground, good visibility in almost every direction. I set up the tent, organized the gear, placed the packs the way I always did. Nothing was out of pattern. And still, from the very first minute, I felt like that space wasn't neutral. Like I was occupying something that already had an owner, not a human one. Something older, more aware. As the day went on, that feeling only intensified. Every time I walked a few yards away from camp, I had the impression something changed behind my back. Not a specific sound, but a shift in the environment, like the air grew heavier. I caught myself looking over my shoulder without realizing it. That had never happened before. Not like that, not so constantly. That first night, I barely slept. Not because of noise, but because of the lack of it. Forests usually lull you to sleep with small sounds, subtle movement, life in motion. There, nothing. Just the occasional wind moving through the highest canopy. I remember thinking that if something large approached, I'd hear it. The truth is, I heard absolutely nothing, and that feels ironic now. The next morning, the first sign appeared. It wasn't a direct encounter, nothing headline-worthy. It was simple, but impossible to ignore once you saw it. A few yards from camp, 3 young trees had been bent and woven together in a way too precise to be accidental. They weren't broken. They were twisted, shaped. The wood was still alive, fresh, which meant it had been done recently, very recently. I stood there staring at that structure, trying to understand it. Wind doesn't do that. Animals don't do that. Not like that. It required strength, intent, and time. I grabbed the camera, took photos from different angles, measured distances, touched the wood. Everything inside me said it wasn't natural, but my mind still insisted on finding an acceptable explanation, some kind of old marker, forgotten human interference. I needed it to be that. As the day went on, more details appeared. Stones stacked at specific points along the trail I'd used. Not random piles, but small arrangements, always visible, always on my path. On higher ground, I found bones arranged on a flat rock, laid out in a circular pattern. They weren't there by chance. They weren't common remains of predation. That was communication. Even without understanding the message, I knew it was meant for me. If you've ever heard of strange signs in the forest, write the word signs in the comments. Don't explain. Don't justify. Just write it. Those who've seen it recognize it. What disturbed me most wasn't finding those signs, but realizing they were always positioned, so I'd find them easily. I didn't have to search. They revealed themselves, as if someone wanted me to know I wasn't alone. And the more I tried to rationalize it, the clearer it became that it wasn't an aggressive warning. It was an announcement, a declared presence. By the time the sun set on the second day, I had no doubt something had been wrong since the moment I entered that area. The difference was that now I had visual, physical, undeniable proof. Even so, I had no idea it was only beginning, because that night something would cross an invisible line, something that would make it clear that watching had only been the first phase. After that second day, it became impossible to pretend I was dealing only with isolated natural phenomena. The signs repeated, but not chaotically. There was pattern. There was intent. The bent tree structures didn't appear randomly. They were always placed at strategic points, trail entrances, areas with clear views of camp, places I would inevitably pass. Some were simple, 3 trunks interwoven into a low arch. Others were complex, with branches twisted at angles that would require immense force without breaking the wood internally. I began documenting everything more carefully. Photos, measurements, notes, timestamps, positions relative to the sun, proximity to water. Everything by scientific protocol. But the more data I gathered, the less sense it made to fit it into any known animal behavior. This wasn't common territorial marking. It wasn't mating. It wasn't defense. It was communication. And not communication for other animals. It was meant for me. The bones appeared again on the third day, this time in an even more disturbing location. They were arranged on a fallen log, aligned in an almost symmetrical sequence. They weren't fresh remains. They were clean, with no bite marks, as if they'd been treated before being placed there. In the center, a skull turned directly toward my camp. My stomach dropped instantly, not from direct fear, but from the clarity of the message. I was being watched closely. I began noticing symbols carved into the bark of certain trees. Not letters, not known trail markings. Simple shapes repeated in different locations. Circles within circles. Parallel lines. Imperfect triangle. Always at chest height. Always on older trees. The wood was still light, indicating the carvings were recent. I ran my fingers over the grooves and felt how deep they were. This hadn't been done with a knife or metal tool. It was done with brute force and fine control at the same time. I tried to rationalize, tried to convince myself it could be an isolated human group, some unknown ritual, maybe even a dangerous prank, but nothing supported that theory. No human footprints, no trash, no sign of human camps, no parallel trails. Just the signs, always the signs, always reminding me there was logic there, even if I couldn't decode it yet. If you've ever heard of bent trees, strange symbols, or organized bones in remote forests, write "not an animal" in the comments. Just that. Anyone who knows the wild understands. Nature doesn't create geometry for no reason. By late afternoon on the third day, I was mentally exhausted, not from walking, but from the constant tension. The feeling of being evaluated never left me. I started instinctively avoiding certain trails without knowing why. It was as if my body was reacting before my mind, and maybe it was. That night, something changed. Levels. I was inside the tent, reviewing notes by flashlight, when I heard the first sound that didn't come from me or the wind. A dry, rhythmic sound. Knock, knock, long pause, knock. Knock, knock, knock. It came from far away, probably the other side of the valley. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was precise. I turned off the flashlight immediately and stayed completely still, trying to understand. The sound repeated in the exact same pattern, with the same interval. Bet? wasn't chance. It wasn't a falling tree. It wasn't an animal hitting something randomly. It was rhythm, long-distance communication, like someone testing echo, measuring response, mapping space. What unsettled me most was realizing that after a few repetitions, the sound seemed to shift position slightly, as if it were being answered from another point, as if there were more than one source. I lay there in absolute silence, listening to that invisible exchange crossing the forest. No words, no shouts, just organized knocks, repeated with purpose. It lasted about 20 minutes, then it stopped completely, as silence returned heavier than before. I barely breathed that night. Every small crack made my entire body tense. I knew then that whatever was out there wasn't improvising. There was method. There was coordination. There was intelligence. When daylight began to break, I exited the tent with extreme caution. That's when I realized something had been moved during the night. My gear wasn't scattered. It wasn't damaged. It was simply relocated. My pack, which I clearly remembered hanging out of reach of animals, was on the ground, positioned beneath a small improvised structure of branches, as if someone had tried to protect it from moisture. There were no claw marks, no common tracks, but the ground around it was pressed down in a strange way, as if something large had moved there calmly, without rush, without missteps. I stared at it for a long time, with the clear feeling that this was no longer a warning phase. It was direct interaction, and in that moment, I understood the signs weren't just to show presence. They were guiding me towards something bigger, something I couldn't yet imagine, but that had been decided long before I arrived. After that night, nothing at camp felt truly mine. There were no signs of chaos, no destruction, but everything was different. It felt like walking into a room where someone had been while you slept, carefully moved things, and left without obvious traces. My pack was positioned precisely under a small structure of interwoven branches, angled to divert dew or light rain. This wasn't improvisation. The branches were chosen by size, fitted with precision, supported so they wouldn't collapse. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. I spent several minutes just observing, trying to find any explanation that didn't involve what I was already beginning to accept deep down. There were no common tracks, no quadruped marks, no careless disturbance of soil. And yet, the ground was compressed, flattened in an odd way, as if something very heavy had passed through with long, steady steps, distributing its weight evenly. The more I analyzed it, the clearer it became this wasn't curiosity, it was control. They knew where I stored everything. They knew what needed protection. They knew what shouldn't be touched yet. And the most disturbing detail was that word yet. This wasn't a single warning. It was a stage. Throughout the day, I noticed my movement through the area was being silently accompanied. Every time I left camp, new subtle signs appeared along the way. Small stone stacks marking turns, branches broken at heights incompatible with common animals, bent trees indicating specific directions. They weren't explicit orders, but clear suggestions. When I ignored a marked path and tried another, I encountered difficult obstacles, closed-off areas, unstable ground. When I followed the indicated routes, everything flowed with a strange ease. I began to feel the uncomfortable sense that I was no longer exploring the forest. I was being guided by it, or rather, by those who controlled it. Late that afternoon, I decided to test something simple. I deliberately left an object out of place, visible, far from the pattern I'd maintained since the beginning. A small piece of equipment, nothing essential, but clearly mine. I wanted to see if it would provoke a reaction. I returned to the tent at dusk with a tightness in my chest I couldn't fully explain. Part of me knew it wasn't a good idea, but another part needed to confirm whether interaction had passed the point of passive observation. That night, the silence returned completely. No distant knocks. No rhythmic sounds. Nothing. I slept poorly, waking several times with the sensation something had approached the tent. When daylight came, I stepped out carefully. The object I'd left was gone. Instead, I found it several yards away, carefully placed on a flat rock, aligned with two other natural elements. as if part of an intentional composition. That eliminated any remaining doubt. This wasn't chance. It wasn't animal curiosity. It was response. If you're following along, write the word control in the comments. Don't explain. Don't argue. Just write it. It matters to those who've lived something similar and never found words for it. From that point on, the sense of invasion became complete. There was no longer a clear separation between what was my space and what was theirs. My camp hadn't been violated aggressively, but it had been integrated into their territory. I was no longer a foreign body tolerated at a distance. I was inside their system, even without fully understanding its rules. On one of the nearby trails, I found something that completely shifted my perception of the situation. The ground was marked by a sequence of deep depressions, evenly spaced. They weren't footprints in the traditional sense, but clear impressions of steps. Bipedal, far too long for any average human. The distance between marks easily exceeded 6 feet. The depth suggested enormous weight. I crouched beside one and compared it to my boot. The difference was humbling. I followed that trail cautiously, feeling my heart race with every yard. Not because I expected an attack, but because everything indicated I was being led exactly where they wanted. The trail didn't meander. It advanced in a relatively straight line, intelligently navigating natural obstacles, avoiding overly open areas, always maintaining visual cover. This wasn't flight, it was guidance. In some sections, the impressions vanished entirely on rocky ground, only to reappear farther ahead, as if whoever was walking knew exactly where to leave traces and where to erase them. That alternation between visible and invisible sent an immediate chill through me. It required spatial awareness, planning, and intent. I should have turned back then. Every rational part of me said so. But something stronger was at play. A dangerous mix of scientific curiosity and the strange feeling that I no longer had full control over my choices. Following that trail felt less like a decision and more like a consequence. The farther I went, the more the environment changed. The trees grew older, the ground more protected, the wind sounded different. It felt like passing through layers of the same place, each more isolated than the last. The flattened trail seemed to lead inward, toward something central. I felt with uncomfortable clarity that I was being tested, evaluated not just for courage, but for my ability to recognize limits. When I stopped to catch my breath, I had the unmistakable sense I was no longer alone there. I didn't see anyone. I heard nothing. But the air felt different, charged, present, as if multiple gazes were fixed on me, calculating every movement, every hesitation. In that moment, I understood. The camp intrusion hadn't been the most serious point. That had only confirmed I was inside their territory. What came next would be the first real contact, no longer at a distance, no longer through indirect signs. Something was about to reveal itself directly, and I knew there would be no pretending normal after that. I reached the highest point of the trail early the next morning, when fog still covered everything like a thick, uneven blanket. Visibility was no more than 50 yards in any direction, and the world felt reduced to blurred shadows and incomplete silhouettes. The air was colder up there, heavier, as if the place were separated from the rest of the forest by something more than altitude. I paused to catch my breath, trying to ignore the constant feeling that I wasn't alone, even without hearing a thing. That's when I saw it. On the ridge, across the valley, a shape stood out against the gray sky. It didn't move. It didn't try to hide. It was simply there. Too tall, too wide. Its posture disturbed me most. It wasn't that of an animal ready to flee or attack. It was upright, balanced, almost observant. Even from a distance, it was clear it was facing me directly. There was no doubt I had been noticed. My entire body locked up, not from panic, but from an overwhelming clarity that took over my mind. This wasn't imagination, light trickery, or exhaustion-induced illusion. The silhouette was far too solid for any easy explanation. Broad shoulders, long arms, hanging at its sides, a proportionally large head. Everything defied comparison to an ordinary human, yet carried something eerily familiar. Time seemed to stretch, I can't say whether it lasted seconds or minutes. I only know that during that interval, neither of us moved. There was no threat, no aggressive gesture, just mutual recognition. And maybe that was the most disturbing part. The sense that I wasn't facing something impulsive, but something conscious, evaluating whether I posed danger or mere curiosity. Then, without warning, the figure turned, not hurriedly, not in fear. It simply rotated its body in a smooth motion and vanished into the fog as if it had decided that observation was complete. There was no sound of breaking branches, no running, nothing to betray its retreat, just absence. I stood there for several minutes afterward, trying to reorganize what had just happened. Part of me screamed to turn back immediately, dismantle camp, and leave the area as fast as possible. Another part, more dangerous, more curious, understood that moment had been deliberate. It wasn't an accidental encounter. It was permission, a limit temporarily lifted. If you're still following, write the word "look" in the comments. Don't explain. Those who understand, understand. I decided to continue, not because I felt safe, but because everything in me said that was the expected next step. I carefully descended to where the figure had stood. The fog began to thin, revealing DAMP ground covered in a thin layer of fresh mud. That's where I found the first footprint. It was enormous, not just in length, but in width and depth. 5 clearly defined toes, visible arch, heel pressed deep. The impression sank into the soil in a way that would require tremendous weight. I placed my boot beside it for comparison. It looked like a child's. My heart raced in a way I couldn't control. This was no longer suggestion. It was physical evidence. I photographed it, measured it, took notes, hands shaking, trying to keep my mind functional. I followed the trail with heightened focus. The footprints advanced in an almost straight line with remarkable regularity. The distance between them indicated long, efficient strides, no wasted motion. This wasn't wandering, it was deliberate travel. And then suddenly, the footprints stopped, not gradually, not due to a smooth change in terrain. They simply vanished upon reaching rocky ground where impressions couldn't form. What was strange was that on the other side, where the soil softened again, there was no continuation, no attempt to resume the trail, no return marks, nothing, as if whoever walked there knew exactly where they could and couldn't be followed. That sent an immediate chill through me, not just because of the evasion, but because of the intelligence behind it. That required deep knowledge of the terrain, planning, and the ability to anticipate the behavior of anyone following. I wasn't tracking an animal. I was being allowed to proceed up to a point. Beyond that, control fully returned to them. I continued exploring the area for a while, finding other subtle signs. Branches broken high up, rocks strategically moved, trees showing recent twisting. Everything suggested that ridge wasn't just an occasional lookout. It was a frequently used location, a boundary, a natural watch point. The more I absorbed it, the clearer an uncomfortable truth became. The visual encounter hadn't been the climax. It had been an introduction, a way of saying, now you know. And once you know, there's no going back to comfortable ignorance. As I descended toward camp, I felt the environment shift again. The silence felt less neutral, more attentive, as if the entire forest were reacting to that direct contact. I constantly felt watched from multiple points at once, even without seeing anything. From that moment on, I knew nothing would be indirect anymore. The signs, the trails, the structures, all of it had prepared the ground for what came next. The first visual encounter was the final warning before something much bigger revealed itself. Something that would no longer happen at a distance, nor at the edge of fog, but far closer, far more definitive. And I had no idea how much it would cost me. After that encounter on the ridge, nothing worked the way it should have. Not just me, the tools, the instruments, the basic references that had always kept me oriented in the field. The compass began spinning endlessly, even when held still in my palm. The needle didn't wobble. It rotated, slow and steady, as if north no longer existed in that part of the forest. I tried recalibrating, changing position, moving away from any metal. Nothing worked. The GPS failed next. First, it lost accuracy. Then it showed inconsistent coordinates. Finally, it lost signal entirely. No satellites. Blank screen. That made no sense in open terrain, especially on elevated ground with a clear view of the sky. What I felt wasn't immediate panic, but a deep, almost personal discomfort, as if I were entering an area where certain tools were not welcome. I kept walking, even without reliable references, because something strange began to happen. The forest seemed to push me in a specific direction. Not obviously, but subtly. Natural paths appeared exactly where I needed to go. Dense areas closed off when I tried to divert. Fallen branches blocked alternate routes. It was as if the environment itself was being rearranged to limit my choices. I wasn't lost. I was being guided. If you've ever felt like a place was leading you somewhere, write the word guided in the comments. Don't explain, just write it. The farther I went, the older the environment felt. The trees were larger, more twisted, with thick trunks covered in irregular moss patterns. The ground was different, wetter, darker, smelling of stone and deep earth. The sound of my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the place absorbed noise. I felt a strange pressure in my ears, not painful, but constant, like descending to a depth that didn't match the elevation. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before: the rock formations. Large limestone blocks appeared along the path, some partially covered by vegetation, others exposed, forming narrow natural corridors too deliberate to ignore. At one point, I saw an opening between two stone walls. It wasn't a typical cave. It was a passage, narrow, elongated, with markings along the sides that indicated frequent use. I stood in front of that opening for a long time. Part of me knew crossing. It meant stepping over a definitive line, not just physical, but mental. It wasn't simple curiosity. It was the clear sense that I was about to see something I couldn't unsee. The air inside was colder, denser. It smelled of ancient earth and deep moisture. I went in. The limestone corridor narrowed in places, forcing me to turn sideways. The walls were smooth in certain areas, as if large hands had touched them repeatedly over time. In other sections, deep marks suggested old scratches, not recent, but constant. The ground was uneven, yet clearly used. There were no accumulated leaves, no debris. This wasn't an abandoned space. The corridor made two sharp turns before opening completely. When I crossed the final narrow point and took the last step out of the passage, my body reacted before my mind. The air left my lungs all at once. I stood there, unable to move forward, for several seconds. In front of me was a wide space, a kind of natural clearing surrounded by high rock walls, like an amphitheater hidden in the heart of the forest. And scattered throughout that space were structures, not fallen trees, not natural formations, structures. They were built from thick branches, interwoven trunks, compacted mud, and plant fibers. Some were rounded, others elongated, all clearly planned, positioned deliberately with the terrain close to a water source running quietly through the center. They weren't improvised. They weren't recent. They were inhabited. There were designated fire areas, with stones arranged in circles and ashes still dark, indicating recent use. Elevated racks with food remained drying, protected from smaller animals. Tools laid out carefully, made of stone, bone, and wood, shaped with precision. Nothing there was random. Nothing there was primitive in the way we usually imagine. My brain desperately searched for an acceptable explanation, some unknown human group, some illegal occupation, anything that wasn't the obvious conclusion forming in front of me. But no hypothesis held, not in that place, not in that way, not with that level of silent organization, invisible to the outside world. What disturbed me most was the sense of presence. I still didn't see anyone, but I knew with near physical certainty that I wasn't alone in that space. The silence there was different from the open forest. It was attentive, expectant, as if the place itself was watching my reaction, waiting for my next move. If you've made it this far, write "shouldn't exist" in the comments. Just that, because that's exactly what I felt in that moment. I took a few more steps into that hidden clearing, legs heavy, heart racing, mind split between awe and fear. Every detail reinforced the same impossible conclusion. This wasn't a temporary camp. It was a settlement, a place of permanence, a space maintained, protected, and deliberately hidden. And as I tried to process all of that, the environment shifted again. Not visually, but in how the air seemed to move, as if something had repositioned behind me, as if the decision to let me enter had been accompanied by another, far more serious one. Because crossing that limestone passage wasn't just entering a forbidden place. It was announcing my presence in a world that existed perfectly well without me. And in that moment, I still didn't know whether I had been invited or captured. I had barely taken a few steps into that space when they appeared. They didn't emerge suddenly, didn't leap from behind structures, didn't make a sound. They were simply there, first one, then another, then two more, until I realized I was surrounded in a wide, calculated formation, without haste. There was no aggression in their gestures, but there was no doubt about who had absolute control of the situation. They were larger than I'd imagined, not just tall, but dense, solid, with a physical presence that made the space feel smaller. Their hair varied in dark tones, some with lighter areas across the shoulders and chest. Their faces were flatter than those of large primates, with deep-set, attentive eyes that reflected light in a way that immediately unsettled me. It wasn't an empty stare. It was evaluated. I froze completely. Any sudden movement would have been interpreted as a threat, and I understood that instinctively. They positioned themselves to limit my movement, but left an open space in front of me, as if they wanted me to remain exactly where I was. It wasn't physical imprisonment. It was strategic containment. As I tried to steady my breathing, I began noticing details of the community around me more clearly. The structures weren't just improvised shelters. They were built to last. Thick branches interwoven, reinforced with dried mud, low entrances to retain heat, upper openings for smoke release, separate areas for different functions, food preparation, rest, work, tools arranged in rows. Nothing scattered, nothing random. The organization was silent, efficient, almost ritualistic. This wasn't basic survival. It was culture. One of them, larger than the others, with a lighter marking across his right shoulder, stepped forward. He didn't advance quickly. He simply moved enough to make it clear he was the reference point, the leader, if I can call him that. He emitted a low, deep sound, not aggressive, but impossible to ignore. The others responded with subtle variations of the same sound. It wasn't noise. It was communication. I slowly raised my hands, showing I carried nothing offensive. The leader tilted his head slightly, as if acknowledging the gesture. Then his gaze fixed directly on the camera hanging from my chest. I understood before any movement happened. That camera was a problem. He extended his arm. There was no explicit threat, but the gesture left no room for negotiation. I hesitated for a second. That device held all the proof of what I'd seen so far. Every image, every record, but hesitation was a mistake. Immediately, the others stepped forward in unison, tightening the space. Not to attack, to reinforce the rule. I handed over the camera. He held it with surprising care, turned it over in his hands, examining it as if he fully understood its function. Then, without showing any emotion, he smashed it against a nearby large stone. The sound of plastic and glass shattering echoed through the space. A dry, final crack. Something inside me broke with it. Before I could react, another approached and tore the GPS from my belt. Same fate. Then the satellite phone I kept for extreme emergencies. Destroyed with the same precision. They knew exactly where to look. Every pocket, every compartment. This wasn't random. It was systematic. In a matter of minutes, every piece of technology I carried had been reduced to unrecognizable fragments. No exceptions, no discussion. That was the rule. Technology did not leave that place. Evidence did not exist, and without evidence, there was no simple way out. If you're still following, write no evidence in the comments. Just that, because that's the line between what can be told and what has to be buried. When it was over, the leader made a different gesture, pointing toward one of the larger structures. The message was clear. I was to enter. I walked with slow steps, legs heavy, mind spinning. As I crossed the low entrance, I had to bend. Down, inside, the space was larger than it appeared from outside. The ground was covered with a thick layer of plant fibers and dried hides. There were clear signs of frequent use. This wasn't a cage. It was a shelter. They didn't enter with me. They remained outside, but I knew I wasn't alone. There was constant surveillance, moving shadows, silent presence. I wasn't a typical guest, but I wasn't treated as an enemy either. I existed in a difficult-to-define middle state, tolerated, observed, continuously evaluated. The days that followed began to blur together in my memory. Time there seemed to function differently. They were more active at dawn and dusk, moving through the community with impressive efficiency. During the day, many stayed in the shadows, resting, working in silence. At night, the place was never completely still. Someone was always awake. Eyes were always watching. As time passed, I began noticing something even more disturbing. They weren't keeping me there just for their own safety. They were studying me, watching how I reacted, how I adapted, how I respected boundaries. There were areas of the settlement I was never invited to approach, and all it took was getting too close to feel their presence intensify. No gestures were needed. I understood. The rule was clear. Even without words, I could remain as long as I wasn't a threat, as long as I didn't try to record, as long as I accepted that their world didn't need proof to exist. And that's when something began to change in the dynamic between us. Something I never would have anticipated when I crossed that limestone passage, thinking I was just following tracks. Because destroying my equipment wasn't the end of the interaction. It was the beginning of another phase. A phase in which I stopped being just a tolerated intruder and began to be integrated in a far deeper, far more dangerous way. And I had no idea what the real cost of that integration would be. After they destroyed everything I'd brought as evidence, something changed in how they treated me. It wasn't immediate or explicit, but over the days, it became clear I was no longer seen only as a risk. I had crossed boundaries, yes, but I'd also shown something important. I could learn, observe, and respect rules without needing them explained. In that place, that mattered. The shift began when one of the elders was injured. It wasn't traumatic. No attack, no violence. Just a simple accident near the fire. Serious. Enough to concern the group. Burned skin, visible pain, limited movement in his arm. I recognized the problem before I even realized everyone was watching me. There was no direct request, no clear gesture, but there was expectation. I helped as best I could. I used what I remembered of field first aid, adapted with what they already used. Plants I recognized, clean fibers, cold water from the stream. I worked with extreme care, knowing any mistake could completely change my situation there. While I worked, I felt something I'll never forget. Silent trust. They watched closely, attentive, but didn't interfere. When I finished, the leader lightly touched my shoulder. A simple gesture, heavy with meaning. I was no longer just tolerated. From then on, my presence was accepted differently. I was included in small routines, allowed into areas previously restricted, permitted to observe processes far beyond simple survival. They had social organization, division of labor, care for elders, teaching of the young. Nothing was chaotic. Nothing was purely instinctual. It was a functional, conscious community adapted to remain invisible. But that phase didn't last long. The first sign something was about to go wrong didn't come from them. It came from the sky. I heard it before I saw it. A distant, mechanical, repetitive sound, unlike anything natural. They reacted immediately, not with panic, but with urgency. Quick movements, eyes lifted upward, short, precise gestures. I understood. Instantly, it was human. Human technology, drones, aerial survey, maybe forestry research, maybe something else. It didn't matter. The outcome would be the same. The community shifted into coordinated action. Structures were dismantled, traces erased, objects redistributed. The place that had seemed permanent revealed something I hadn't noticed before. Everything there was designed to disappear. The settlement wasn't fixed. It was adaptable, prepared to vanish without leaving traces. That's when they called me over. The leader, the elder, and another I recognized by his always vigilant posture. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. They were leaving, and I couldn't stay. The choice they offered wasn't spoken, but it was understood with brutal clarity. I could go with them, move deeper into the forest, disappear completely from the human world, abandon everything I'd ever been, or I could return, alone, carrying only what I was allowed to remember. And above all, lie. Wasn't a heroic decision. It was painful. I thought of my family, the life outside that place. Even if it now felt distant and hollow, I thought of the impact my disappearance would have. I also thought about what it would mean to lead humans back there, even unintentionally. The answer was obvious, but that didn't make it easy. They gave me something before I left, a simple handmade object with no value to anyone else. To me, it became an anchor, silent proof I could never show without, destroying everything they protected for so long. They led me out along paths I could never retrace, erased tracks as we walked, confused landmarks. When they finally left me at a point where I recognized human signs, the leader looked at me for a long time. There was no threat in his eyes. There was responsibility. I understood the final agreement there. I would return. I would lie, and they would remain invisible. Getting back was harder than going in. I lied to authorities, to colleagues, to my own family. Each lie became another layer between the world I knew and the world I'd seen. My old life didn't survive intact. I left my career, my plans, my relationship with the forest as it once was. Everything was contaminated by the truth I couldn't tell. To this day, I carry that object with me, not as proof for others, but as a reminder of what I chose to protect, and the price I paid for it. There's a part of this story that still weighs more than everything I've told here. Something that happened later, far from that place, and that completely changed how I understand their silence. But that doesn't belong to this account. On the screen now is another video. It talks about different secrets, but it comes from the same ancient silence, the same kind of impossible choice, and the same consequences that never appear in official records. If this story stayed with you after it ended, that next one will too.